Good afternoon, everybody. And before we begin, I just want to clarify something. It was rather amusing, and it only came to me a few minutes ago. I was sitting there at the beginning, and everybody was walking in, and it felt like every alternate person was introducing themselves to me as if we'd known each other for years. And it was only halfway through that I realized everybody thought I was Serge. So just sort of going back a step, my name is Jimmy. I'm not... Serge is sitting down there. I will use him in a minute. And Dom... This is a journey I'm going to take you on now. It's a very personal journey, so sit back, relax. It's a little bit abstract on occasions, but it's going to begin with this. Don very kindly introduced me as a photographer, and he put an adjective in front of it, which is a little bit debatable. But I think that's why this image is very, very significant. I don't actually see myself as a photographer. In many ways, I never have seen myself as a photographer, although I've been making pictures for many, many years. And so much so, this is what the world has become today. You and everybody, and I often joke, my children have accumulated a number of pets, and they attach GoPros to the heads of our dogs and cats, and I think on one occasion a gerbil. Everybody is filming and photographing, so the significance of me as a photographer is not particularly relevant. But the significance of this kind of photography is how we see ourselves, how I see you, how you see me, and how we see each other. And that's essentially what this journey is about. So I'm going to begin with a selfie. It's a selfie of me, a picture I made of myself. I rarely do it, but on this particular occasion, it was a very, very significant moment. It looks as if I'm happy, I'm smiling, you can see my white teeth, and I'm a little bit hairy for an occasion. But it was a moment where everything had gone wrong. Every aspect of my life at that moment had essentially gone, and Brum used the expression a few minutes ago, which I think is actually great, although sometimes unfair, pear-shaped. First of all, I was cold, about minus 40 degrees centigrade. I was lost, I was disorientated, I was depressed, I was homesick, everything. And I'd sort of set out on this journey. It was a sort of very naive journey, and I sort of wanted to go off and sort of find the world's last indigenous cultures / tribes, and I wanted to put them on a pedestal. But that's quite a complicated thing. First of all, you have to learn to be able to communicate with them. If you want to interact, if you want to go beyond making a happy snap, a selfie, a reportage picture, if you want to make something iconic, there's an enormous relationship that's involved to begin with. And in this particular case, that relationship failed. It was with the Satan. The Satan are a very small group of nomadic reindeer herders in northern Mongolia. So I sort of went on the journey, and this was about sort of 5 or 6 years ago. And I remember I'd sort of researched it for quite a few years beforehand, and I'd arrived in the nearest village, which was about a 2-week walk, and it was February, and it was cold, and I sort of met somebody. I'm going to have to jump off the stage, because I need to. And I sort of met you. And we were sitting in the local cafe, and we were having a chat, and you actually spoke quite good English. You said, yeah, my name. We shook each other. So I'm desperate to go to the Saturn. He said, yeah, I know the Saturn. I said, great, I found him. I found my guide and my interpreter. So we sort of shook hands, and we were very, very friendly, and we got on very well. And then he said to me, money. And I said, money? Yeah, money. Okay, sure. How much do you need? And we came to what was quite a reasonable price. So we shook hands, and off we went walking. Are you going to come walking with me briefly? And we went for a bit of a walk, and this walk went on for about 2 weeks, and then you can go and sit down. And then eventually I'll get back up on the stage, and we sort of got there, and there we were, and we were sitting next, and we'd become very, very good friends, and I was extremely confident. There the Saturn were, and I was waiting, and I was ready with my cameras, and I looked at you, and I said, it's time now to communicate. And you sort of looked at me and goes, yeah, there's a slight technical problem. And I said, technical problem? He says, yeah, I don't know this dialect. I said, dialect? We spent the last 2 weeks walking up these valleys together, and you didn't tell me this. Why? And he said, I sort of needed your money. I said, but couldn't you have told me that at the beginning? He said, yeah, but then you wouldn't have paid me. So there we were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of winter, high up on top of a mountain, 40 people I was desperate to communicate with, and I couldn't. But sort of, I was a little bit angry, but I didn't want to show it, and I thought, well, it'll be okay, it'll be okay. So I looked at you sort of a little bit sort of sheepishly, and thought, well, patience, 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 I'll find a way. Well, I didn't. I spent another 2 weeks traveling with them day and night across the mountains, in and out of their tents with their reindeer, and there wasn't one form of contact, thanks to you. Not one picture, not one film, and that was the moment of the selfie. And there I was that day, made the picture, and every evening they would put up there with these nomads, 40 of them, and I think if you look in this corner of the room, there were about 40 people there. If you could imagine all of us, every night, after a long day walking across the mountains with our reindeer, we would all crawl into one tent together. And the only way to keep warm was sit and lie and cuddle each other. So even though there was no communication, there was an enormous amount of physical contact. So we would all crawl in together, arms and legs, hands and knees, each other's groins and armpits. And what they always did, they would get out a bottle, and the bottle would pass around the tent. And it was a sort of homemade rocket fuel, loosely described as vodka. And prior to that, I was trying to be very professional. I was on my mission. I was going to make these iconographic pictures, so I didn't want to wake up with a hangover. But on that day of the selfie, I realized I've got nothing to lose, nothing to lose whatsoever. So I'm going to have a sip. So they passed me the bottle, and I had a sip, and magic. The analogy is if you've ever jumped into cold water wearing a wetsuit and then had a pee, that's what it felt like. It was amazing. So this sort of warm sort of wave went down through my body. I thought, this is fantastic. Why haven't I been drinking for the last 2 weeks? Everything would have been okay. So I drank, and essentially in an hour, I finished the whole bottle. I was drunk, seriously drunk, and I'm not really a drinker, but I sort of looked around me, and the tent was spinning, and the whole tent had been drinking, so I didn't mind, and we all fell into a sort of alcohol-induced coma. Fine. Middle of the night, you imagine all of us lying on top of each other, human sardines, drunk as you've ever been before, minus 40 degrees, a storm's blaring, tucked up in this teepee. Then in the middle of the night, it's a technical problem. I sort of woke up, I need a pee. And I sort of looked around in the tent, and I sort of tried to sit up. The tent was spinning, don't quite remember which way. And I thought, well, if I get up now, I'm in serious problems. I'm going to fall on them, and something's going to happen. But as is often the case when one is drunk, one is 10 times smarter than one really is. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to roll over the bodies like a crab. So I'm going to go, and I'm not going to wake anybody. I'm not going to stand. I'm going to get, and I'm not even going to have to go outside. I'm just going to lift up the side of the tent and have a quick pee outside. So I got there, turned back. Everybody was still fast asleep. Great, it's succeeded so far. And then I made a mistake, and as you'll hear in the next few minutes, I tend to make quite a few. So I sort of took off my glove, lifted up the side of the tent, and stuck to the tent. Oh dear, it's pretty cold. But it's all right, I've got another hand. So I looked down and then realized, oh dear, I've got sort of 40 layers of contemporary clothing to undo, and Velcro and buckles and fastens. And there's no way I'm going to be able to get there in time. So I started sort of flailing, half attached to a tent, drunk, everybody's still asleep, flailing to get there. I failed. It went everywhere. I'm not going to describe it exactly, but you can imagine, all over me, actually all over the tent, because it was a big bottle. And I sort of lay there, sort of feeling rather sad and wet, and then turned around, everybody's still asleep. It's okay, that was the intention. So I sort of rolled back as a crab, fell back into my little place in the sardine tin, fell back asleep, until a few minutes later, all hell broke loose. Now, they're reindeer herders, and outside the tent, there were a couple of thousand reindeer. The reindeer decided, for one reason or another, to stampede over the tent. So all of us wake up. We all start screaming. Remember, we're all drunk, grandmas, grandpas, and kids. Everybody's running around, falling into each other. The tent's blowing up the hill, and we're being walked over by reindeer. And then eventually I started backing away from the crowd. And then one after another, I noticed the reindeer start sort of focusing in on me. And I can't quite figure this out. They're getting closer and closer and closer. And they start sort of coming up and nodding at me. And now, if you notice, as you can see, the reindeer have very large antlers. And they start trying to lick me. Now, this is when, it's a little bit like sort of Monty Python on steroids at this point. You think, this can't quite be true. Earlier that day I was making that selfie about being sort of a little bit sad and depressed, but this is going beyond and I'm sort of walking backwards, walking away from these reindeer. And then I realized there's a cliff behind me. By now, I'm about 50 meters from the sat, and it's misty, it's dark. And the inevitable, I start to scream. Now, I didn't just scream out of fear. I screamed out of utter, utter, utter desperation. I'm screaming through the mist. I'm being licked from head to toe by stampede reindeer. And I'm looking down at you, help, 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 screaming at the top of my voice. And then eventually, slowly through the mist, the man on the left saw me. He was the chief. And then the whole village gathered, and they all looked at me. But they didn't come to me. They all pointed to me with one hand, put the other hand over the hip, and bent over double and started laughing. And they laughed, and they screamed with laughter. The more they screamed with laughter, the more I cried, and was hysterically waving for them to come and get me. So in sort of bundles of laughter, the chief sort of pushed the reindeer out of the way, came up to me, grabbed me, and said, no language was needed. He sort of pointed at my groin, and he waved his finger and went, like this, and I was like, nothing's wrong, nothing's wrong. And he essentially said, why did you pee your pants? I didn't pee my pants. It's your reindeer. Get your reindeer into control. And then the long story, he turned around, the whole village turned around and banged their backside like this, and I couldn't quite see what they were doing. And on the back of everybody's backside, they had this big leather flask, handmade leather flask. And then he took his off and put it under my nose, and it smelt of urine, and I sort of retched. And he starts waving his finger and said, why didn't you ask for a flask? And I said, I didn't see you were carrying a flask. He said, observe next time better. Turned out the Satan carry these flasks, they all pee in the flask, and they use the urine, they scatter it across the snow, and that's how the reindeer follow them across the mountains, because it's only ice and snow. It's the only saturation they're ever going to get. So I was a little bit, but why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you tell me about this? And the chief said, yeah, but you didn't tell us you were going to have an accident and pee your pants. So we sort of put up the tent. I sort of fell in the middle of the tent, and I became essentially the laughingstock of the whole community. And the first time we had serious contact, but contact out of, from my point, humility, utter shame that I'd become this sort of wet child in the middle of this mountain, in the middle of Mongolia. And then more bottles came out. All these old ladies with no teeth came up and started sort of pouring vodka essentially all over me, hoping for the same to happen again. And then the next day, a very, very beautiful relationship developed, one of contact, a very sort of childish contact, lots of little children holding my hands, waving a finger, taking me off to the trees where I needed to go, but enabled me to start seeing them, for them to see me and to communicate to them what I was trying to do. What I was trying to do was put them on a pedestal. I was trying to raise them up, trying to celebrate them, and make these very, very powerful, iconographic, painterly, subjective, romantic images of the culture of what they stand for. Now, that story, besides, I've got to take you back a long time and to put it into context. Why on earth am I in the middle of Mongolia? Not particularly being in control of my bowels. Well, it's not for medical reasons. This is me, a 7-year-old child. My father was a geologist. He traveled around the world, and I traveled with him. So I'd seen an enormous amount of the world from a very early age. Subsequently, went off to a boarding school. At the age of 16, was suffering from cerebral malaria, which wasn't particularly pleasant. We'd been living in Sierra Leone. And I arrived back, and I was ill. I was seriously ill, probably a little bit homesick, probably also very stressed, and actually had hoped that my parents had decided to keep me at home on this particular occasion. But they hadn't, because this was form, this was ritual, this was the culture. Off you go to the school. So I remember going up to one of the priests, sort of sweating like a dog, saying, I'm not feeling well. And he said, well, it's fine, fine, fine. If you take this pot of pills and go to bed, you'll wake up in the morning and everything will be okay. So I sort of woke up in the morning, took one look in the mirror, and this is who I met. It was me. Now, many, many years later, my kids say, Dad, that stupid story about you becoming bald, half of Amsterdam is bald. Now, I said, I know. I'm many years older. But when you're 16, and I have teenagers myself at the moment, to wake up and meet somebody else in the mirror the next day is wildly confronting. It's a whole sort of story about identity. Everything changes. Because you yourself, I said, well, I still feel like Jimmy. I see myself as Jimmy, but everybody sees me as somebody completely different. So, having grown up in the third world as a child and suddenly been ostracized and judged myself for having a different appearance, all of a sudden a very, very young empathy came for, in many ways, the underdog, a different culture, a different class, a different race, a different color. So angrily, at the age of 17, I sort of, nobody was going to solve this problem for me. I ran away. I disappeared to the one part of the planet where other children had no hair, although they were shaved, and that was Tibet. This was 1986. I wasn't exploring. I wasn't doing any great sort of discovery, any great long walk. I just put on some robes, and I wanted to find empathy. I wanted to find true contact with other kids that looked like me. And it was inspired by this man, Tintin. It's very simple. There's no great sort of anthropological answer to it. I remember looking in the book as a child and seeing all these little ball boys running around the Himalayas. And then many, many years later, I met this gentleman. This gentleman passed away a long time ago, but he's my inspiration. His name is Edward Sheriff Curtis. Now, Edward Sheriff Curtis is a phenomenon. And if any of you are truly interested in culture and heritage through documentation, you must investigate who he is. Now, he made those very famous pictures, the sepia tone pictures of the chiefs, the Native American Indians. And for 30 years, he traveled around the American Northwest, making the most fantastic documents. And he made 30 different books. But when he finished, he died a pauper. He died in shame. 95% of the images in the books he made were destroyed because they were regarded as irrelevant. Who he'd been documenting, who he'd been celebrating, he was also accused of faking it, were looked upon as less. They were looked upon as not being worthy of his time and his attention because the world was developing and we didn't need them. A few of the pictures re-emerged in the 1970s, and there was shock because people realized, as we do today, this is now all gone, and perhaps there was a far greater value to it than we appreciated at the time. So in a way, I've copied him, or I'm trying to copy him, or emulate him, but on an international stage. So I started a few years ago on this journey, 35 of the world's last and most precious, most powerful, most iconographic individuals, putting them on a pedestal. It is subjective, it's romantic, but it's celebratory. And something sort of quite exciting happened. I published a book One book, remember Edward Curtis published 30, so it's not particularly profound. And the world has changed, so immediately it spreads, and then subsequently everybody has an opinion. I think it was published in about 7,500 publications, and on the strength of that, another 7,500 production companies, television, radio, came to me and said, Jimmy, with questions. What is this? Who is this? Who are you? This is not true. Are you faking it? Or like Edward Curtis, thousands of questions, and to be honest, many of which I didn't actually have answers to. But often when you challenge yourself, when you dare to say what you feel, even though you don't know the consequences of that, you become far wiser in the process. And it's even got to the stage, a young colleague of mine set up some social media page on Facebook, and we were banned for tribal pornography. And then it went even further. One organization started accusing me of wrong-headed obsession with vanishing indigenous cultures. Now, wrong-headed it is not, but obsession it is, and I won't deny that. And I want to take you on a few stories, provide you a few journeys, and show you what I experienced in that process. So to begin with, I need a little bit of help. Serge, can you help join me quickly? I need a tribal leader, essentially sort of a cannibal. So Serge, if you can come here a minute. Everybody always asks me, if you come and stand here, you don't have to do anything, don't worry. Stand here and be straight. You arrive in a village, this is in Papua New Guinea, and to all intents and purposes, these people are cannibals. They don't want you there, they don't want your money, they don't have money, they don't know what photography is. And the most important thing you do is how are you going to make contact? You have to invert the process. They are in control. They are the strong, they are the powerful. They can do anything with you what you want, other than feed you vodka and to pee in your pants. And essentially I say, you are the boss. And then you've got this whole group of people surrounding you, sometimes hundreds, and they're grunting and they're puffing and they're kicking and they're punching and they're poking. And they're trying to intimidate you. And you actually have to say, you're the boss, you're the boss, you're the boss, and you give in. And this process goes on for days, and you get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, until eventually people start disappearing, they start getting bored, and then there's one who's left over. He's a little bit curious. And today it's Serge, and Serge, he'd be looking at me for days. I think, what's this strange person from another valley doing on the floor? Then next to me, I've got this old box, and in this box there's an old 50-year-old technical plate film camera. And I'll explain more about that in a minute. I start slowly building it, putting it on a tripod, but always making sure I'm smaller, keeping my head low, and then eventually I come up and I look at Serge and I touch him and I go, oh, wow, you're strong. Well, you're amazing. Put your hand there. Oh, God, keep your chest out. Go, wait, don't move. And I put the camera on the tripod and then I start focusing the screen, and it's very cumbersome, very old, and I'm sweating and I can't see what I'm doing because I've got no eyebrows. And then every now and again I come, hold your back straight. That's amazing. And you start developing this relationship, this one of praise, this one of worship, this one of put you on a pedestal. And then, chin. And then eventually you get into a position after hours and hours and hours where Serge is beginning. He's beginning to enjoy it, but then you need help, because you look at him, you've got this camera and this film, and there's no light, it's dark, and you need the daylight, so you need the rest of the villagers back. So quickly, come, I need the three of you, quickly on the stage, because we're running out of time. You're now enthusiastic, so you run. And all of a sudden, in my bag, I've got a whole load of reflectors. So I go, Dom, you come here, and then you come back, you come here, go, low. You see the sun's coming up there? See the sun like that? You've got to bounce it onto his face. Don't you move. You come down here, low. You see, you've got to get very low. You see the shadow on his face. You've got to hold the reflector like that. Keep looking in the camera. Come back. But you can keep running, and the sun is moving. Get down there. You've got to hold, you're the strong one. You've got to hold the big reflector. Go like that. Okay. And then the whole thing, but it's not like a studio where everything's static. The sun's moving. You've got to keep looking at me. Keep still. Everybody concentrate. And then now the shutter's got to open for 5 seconds, because this is an old camera, very slow film. 5. Shh. Back up straight. Shh. Breathe through your nose. Breathe. Shh. Okay. Shh. Silence. Then you put the film in. You shut the camera down and you click. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah! And if the picture's the one you want, you hug him. And then he hugs me, and then everybody's jumping. And so you're amazing. The picture is beautiful. You're amazing. And then, seriously, then all of a sudden you stand up and you say, I'm more important than him. And then you come and say, it's my turn. I've got bigger muscles. And I'm bigger. It's my turn. You start looking at me. And then before you know, you spend the whole day. You have to photograph the whole village. Everybody wants to sit in the chair. Everybody wants to be seen. Everybody wants to be worshipped. And then you finish at the end of the day. Thank you. You can go and sit down. And you think, it's all done. And then Serge comes to me to the next morning, he looks at me and he points, and a whole nother village from another valley is all lined up, because they've heard there's this strange person with some legs and a box, and he looks at you for hours saying you're amazing. So in a way, it's about sort of seeing people, acknowledging them, putting them on a pedestal, making them high, making them strong, making them spectacular. And then you take it a stage further. You've made the portraits, you've made the contact. In some cases, you may even get to know their names. And then you say, I want to put them into context. I want to see the spectacular aspect of your nature, and you're in it. And then you go for a walk, and you walk for 2 to 3 days. In this case, with the huli in Papua New Guinea, you find the waterfall, and you place them there. But again, this picture takes hours, sometimes days, because it's a long shutter speed. You want to get the mist, you want to get the movement, you want to get the artistry, you want to get the pride, you want to get the power, you want to show them these are the world's living avatars. They still do exist. Now, they may be yellow as opposed to blue, they may be real as opposed to a digital fantasy, but there's something very, very extraordinary about these people and the lessons that they have and the knowledge and the wealth that they have. And then you have people like this. I always put him, he reminds me of Robin Williams, with all due respect, sort of a little Mrs. Doubtfire. Yeah. And then you go further. I don't know, is anybody here, I mean, you're all very, very well traveled. Has anybody here been to Chukotka, far northeastern Russia? Okay, well, I hadn't either. It's seriously remote, but it was a dream destination of mine because in Chukotka live, to all intents and purposes, from my aesthetic perspective, non-anthropological, the world's last Eskimos. And I'd sort of, for 4 years, been online making contact with a Chukchi living in Anadyr, and I said, I'm going to come. And he said, yeah, I'll organize a trip for you. We'll find the Chukchis together. So off I went, and one day I arrived. It's a 13-hour flight from Moscow, so it's a seriously long journey. And there he was at the airport, proud and handsome. And I said, great, I'm ready. Where are they? And he sort of looked at me and he goes, yeah, slight technical problem, Jimmy. Chukotka is a big place. It's the big as France. I said, that's fine. You know, I've been on lots of journeys. He said, but there's only 80 of them split into 2 groups, 2 brigades, and they move. They're nomads. I said, yeah, but you know where they are. We've spent the last 4 years online communicating. He says, well, I have no idea. But we can try and find them. I said, we can try? What do you mean try? How long will it take? And he says, I have no idea. But our limit is 2 months, because on the roof of this tank we're going to take, we have 2 months of diesel. So it's 2 months okay. I'm sort of sitting there scratching my 2 months. I can't just disappear indiscriminately into the tundra looking for 2 groups of 40 people and not know whether I'm going to... I need my guarantees. And he sort of looked at me and said, I can't guarantee you anything. So as you can see, we sort of got into this tank and we went on a very odd journey. And, you know, and going back to sort of old friends of mine, the reindeer, and very important in this particular story, I said, how are we going to find them? And he said, oh, that's easy. I'm going to sit on the roof, and I'm going to watch the distribution of the reindeer droppings and their age, and then I can tell you where they've moved to and how far away they are. So I was a little bit uncomfortable with that, but I didn't quite get my wincing. So we went, and we got into this tank, and we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there, and we sat there for 29 days. Now, it's not quite as an achievement having sort of walked the great length of China, but it's sort of a mental adventure. You're sitting in this box going at 10 kilometers an hour. You wake up every morning at minus 20 degrees centigrade, and you have no idea where you are. You have no idea where you're going, whether you're ever going to get there anyway. And then 29 days later, we came across these mountains. Here's the tank, and there's the cameraman Bram, who was with me, sitting on the roof, and the Chukchi guide, and we saw this in the distance. And this is spectacular. This is like sort of arriving in Manhattan for the first time, a tent on the ice, and it was wildly exciting. So we came down off this thing, and I was sort of kind of pent up, having spent... I came down, we saw these people having a picnic. And then in the middle of them was this chief that I'm sort of coming to, amazingly handsome guy. And this was the guy I wanted to photograph. So literally jumped out of the tank, no time for sort of all these stories and handsome, handsome, handsome. Unpacked my box, put the camera in front of him and says, oh, you're stunning. You're so, sit still, sit still. And he sort of looked at me, and the whole village came around together. And they looked at me, and we had a very good translator. And he sort of looked over and he goes, be careful. I said, no, come on, I'm running out of time. I need to make my pictures. And the guy looked at me, and he raised a massive finger, and he waved it in front of my face, and he went, niet. Now, I don't speak Russian, but I sort of understand what niet means. And what do you mean, niet? You have no idea how long it's taken me to get here. He goes, niet, 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 niet. You can't make any film and you can't make any pictures. But he said, what you can do, you're welcome to stay. You are our guest. We would love to have you for however long you want. So I said, you mean after 4 years research, a month sitting in a tank, I'm going to sit and not make a picture? And he says, yeah, you don't have to make pictures of everything, you don't have to film, but you can live with us, you can share with us. And to be honest, we don't have time for pictures and film because it's cold, it's cold, it's cold. We are living on the edge here, so every minute, every second of the day, we need each other to keep alive in this ballet of life. So for the very first time in this whole project, I wasn't making pictures. I was observing in a very intimate way, participating, seeing how they lived, watching how the children every morning would chew and chew and chew for 1.5 hours after breakfast, and asking the chief, what's this all about? And he goes, oh yeah, they're preparing dinner because all the elders don't have teeth. Wow, and then watching the kids take the elderly into the snow to clean them and take them to the toilet because they were infirm. So this beautiful sort of ballet of life, of ages all balancing together. And then towards the end of the trip, 2 weeks in, and eventually, as you can see, they said you could take a few pictures. So it became quite an intense 24 hours. And we had this fantastic conversation. And we were looking at them with the translator, which was in this case very good, and said, what are you doing here? You are at the end of the world. And the chief looked at me and said, we've chosen to be here. I was a little bit confused, and he referred to the city they lived in a few years ago. It's actually this city. And prior to that, the Russian authorities had come to them and said, time has moved on. We do not need you. But we're very proud of the Chukchi. We're going to subsidize you, and we're going to give you a block of flats. They had no objectivity, and they moved to the city. And 6 months later, it's a very long, convoluted story, but I'll keep it very short. Some official came in with a clipboard and looked at them all and said, you Chukchi are not the same people who arrived. And they looked at them, and they looked a bit dour, and he said, you've all become unhappy. And the Chukchi literally said, we didn't know what unhappy meant because it wasn't a word in our dictionary. And eventually it was explained to them, and he turned around and said, yeah, perhaps then we have become unhappy. We've completely lost ourselves. We have no purpose. We have no identity. We're not healthy. We drink. We don't do anything. We don't see our children. We don't see our elders. So we're going to go back. So when we met him, that day we jumped out of the tank. It was almost 3 years to the date that they'd returned to the ice. And what he actually said was because here we feel whole, here we feel complete, this is where we belong, this is where we have a purpose. We may only live for the next 24 hours, but that 24 hours is the richest experience we are ever going to have. And I remember sort of traveling back for another 30 days in this tank through blizzards and sitting there thinking, wow, this is the most extraordinary lesson I've ever been taught. It's one about choice. Now, I'm not asking you all to take off your clothes and run across the ice in furs drinking vodka, but I am telling you to realize, or not telling you sounds a bit sort of patronizing, but asking you to realize that we are often very far, you both were talking about it earlier, very far removed from our natural heritage. We're very far removed from what we truly feel. And in that, we often find it very difficult to make choices which are very important. So the Chukchi reminded me, by their extreme position that they lived, they could keep making those choices that we can all still keep making. And the last story is a little bit melodramatic, but I think it sort of encompasses this whole journey for me. When it has nothing to do with photography, it's purely to do with connection, people seeing me and me making true human contact with others. These are the Kazakh in far northwestern Mongolia, in the Altai Mountains. Travelers amongst you, photographers, filmers, whatever, writers, these are the culture, this is the people, this is the landscape. That's it's wildly beautiful. They have a tradition. Every young boy entering the age of 15, 16, he has to scale these cliffs to become a man. He has to get a baby eagle. He trains that baby eagle. If he hasn't fallen off the cliff, then he spends the rest of his life living and hunting with that eagle. These eagles are sometimes 30 kilos. They have 5-meter wingspans. These people are spectacular. So from my fairly manic characters you've now been introduced to, an aesthetic perspective, this is it. This is what it was all about. So I made all these contacts, took all the portraits and said, oh, please, I found this valley, I found this mountain. You've got to follow me up on top of it. So one morning we walked up and we stood on top. We had to leave at 2 o'clock in the morning. It's a 3-hour walk. It's again cold, about -20. You're standing there in the wind and it's blowing, and I got out that stupid old tripod and the camera, and I'm getting there and I'm looking, and the sun didn't rise. And it's misty and it's gray. And I start thinking, well, this isn't the picture I wanted to make. This isn't what I saw. It's not good enough. So I eventually said, we're not going to make the picture. And they looked at me very confused, still not truly understanding what I was on about. We wandered back down the mountain, and I spent the whole day trying to explain to them light and composition and aesthetic and power. And we're going to do it again, And they were looking at me, waving, essentially saying no. And that morning I banged on all their houses, please come. They did, and we went through the same process again. We're looking. There's no sunrise. Oh no, what do I do now? What do I do? And you have these out-of-body experiences where you think, well, just get out my Nikon and Photoshop a sky and later and turn up the contrast, everything will be okay. And then you have the purist in you thinking, no, this isn't the image I want. It has to be on that plate film. It has to be the pure, all-encompassing story. I'm not going to make the picture. Walk down, they essentially tell me, we're not getting up tomorrow morning at 2 o'clock. And I said, oh, please. So I was on the verge of crying, all down my knees, crawling around the village. You've got to come with me. I've got to get that picture. So the next morning, I essentially dragged them up the mountain. We're standing there, but it's about to happen. The sky is clear, there's a little bit of mist in the background, and the sun starts to rise. It's magical. It is what I expected it to be. But I'm tired, and I'm exhausted. I'm standing there, I get my tripod out, and again I make a mistake. And I'm looking through my camera, my lens is attached to a metal plate. And I sort of lean forward, take off my gloves to change it. My fingers stick to the plate of the lens. And I'm attached to this camera. So after sort of months of research, walking up and down, you're standing on top of a mountain, sort of looking essentially like Mr. Bean, standing there. And then finally the Cossacks, they understand, they're waving their thumb, we're ready, and they're standing there in the wind, and horses are wobbling, and the eagles want to fly away. And you say, I can't move, I'm stuck. It's just not going to happen today. And they sort of, they're really beginning, and they're really going, oh, geez, what have we done with this guy? And then you say, what do I do? And then he said, I've got to take my fingers off. So I sort of took my fingers off, and I sort of left all the skin behind. They started to bleed. It felt like somebody was hammering my fingers with a hammer. And then I realized I couldn't take the picture anymore because I needed my fingers with this cumbersome old camera. So I sort of sat down at the edge of on a rock, and I started to cry. And I cried out of pain, but I also cried out of sort of desperation. Why was I so eccentric? Why did I need to take things so far? Why did I end up in these awkward situations? Sitting there, sort of essentially sobbing without a care in the world. And then one of the Cossacks said, look, he said, ushered me to look behind him. Behind us had walked two of the women from the village, and not this lady, but these big Mongolian women, and they're beautiful, they're handsome, and they're strong, and they have these big hats and these big coats, and they'd followed us up the mountain, because I think on morning 3 they were curious, what on earth are these guys doing up there every day? So and the lady ushered me over like this, and I sort of walked over to my hand, I can't take my other bleed. I was sort of like, this lady opened a jacket, literally grabbed my fingers and put them on her chest. I think it was meant to be her armpits, but I don't quite remember where they ended up. And I sort of fell into her. And the other lady came up to me, opened her jacket, and she entombed me. And these big women, they squeezed me tight, and they rocked me from side to side, and they started muttering. And I cried even harder for probably other reasons, but that's another talk. And I'm sort of standing there on this mountain, sobbing, whatever, and these women rocking me from side to side, side to side. And then 4 or 5 minutes later, sort of semblance of feeling coming back in my fingers, and I begin to think, picture. So pushed these women away, very unlike me, no thank you. So walked over to the camera, sort of bleeding fingers, pulled out a sheet, threw it in, and that was the last picture you saw a few minutes ago. Job done. So we sort of wandered down the mountain, and it was only halfway down that I realized what had truly happened. These Kazakhs, they're Muslims. Now, they're not fundamentalist. I've lived a lot of my life in that part of the world, so I truly understand the significance of this culture. But what they decided was that having had this obscure, odd character with them for the last, in this case it was a couple of months, praising them, putting them on a pedestal, and there he was failing as a human being, they had to, in all their humanity, help him. So they were willing, the men were willing to encourage the women, who were should never have been seen by me, let alone have followed us up a mountain, let alone to present themselves to keep me warm, and such a process. And I think what truly happened was a true human connection. By truly showing my vulnerability, my empathy, and my acknowledgement for who they were, they decided to help me in that process. And I think perhaps that's what this whole journey is about, how we see each other as human beings. But the only way to make that true contact is by truly showing what you feel. So somebody asked me the other day, and that's why I put this in now, what are these pictures all for? Okay, well, I published a book, but I felt very strongly that I was only halfway. I'd taken something. Now, I don't believe I've stolen anybody's soul, but I had to ask her, what were these pictures all about? How was my perception wrong, as some people criticize me being? Was it iconic? Was it idealistic? Was it over-romanticized? Or did it have a greater significance? So I started to travel back with small television crews. And first I went back to the Himba in northern Namibia on the border of Angola. And here's a small clip. Now, first of all, the compliment to actually be given the opportunity to do this blows your mind. You know, you make something, you feel it, you show it, you present it, and people say, we would like to help you ask your question. We'd like to take this story further. So they took it further. It's a little bit melodramatic to begin with, sort of hot air balloons. Not that one arise in northern Namibia in a hot air balloon, not for the sake of the production value. And then we came back, and I remember very specifically coming back to this particular group of Himba, and they looked at me, this is about 3 years later, and they started to cry, and I started to cry, not that I was cold on this particular occasion, because they came up to me and they said, people have filmed us before, people have photographed us before, but nobody has ever taken the time to come back and give us what they took from us. We're curious too, what were you doing the whole time standing behind that box on those legs? What are you doing with the pictures? What do you see? What do you want? What do you want from us? So we had these fantastic conversations, which have been filmed and documented, about how they see themselves, how I see them, whether our values are the same, how they see their future. I think 99.9% of the Himba have moved into the nearest cities. In 2050, 95% of the world's population will be urbanized. These particular groups, not only the Himba, many of the others I've photographed, are the world's last bastions of an indigenous heritage. And that's what this conversation was about. And they're coming in with the book and sort of showing them the pictures and seeing their faces light up as they recognize themselves. And their backs going straight, their eyes lighting up. Truly spectacular. And then you sort of got to the edge of the end of the Himba section, and then you turned over to the Tukshi, and they all jumped because they saw snow and people covered in fur. Then you get into the conversation. Who are these people? Where are they? And so, well, they're as rich as you are. They're as profound as you are. But there are as only few as you are still left on the planet today. And then this is an amusing story. A few weeks later, a film crew from CNN rang me. Hi, my name's Bob. And a little bit aggressive. Yeah, where would you like to go on your mission? I said, well, it's not quite a mission, but I'd love to go back to Vanuatu, 83 islands and an archipelago in the Pacific. Whoa, well, let's meet you in Sydney. So 2 weeks later, I arrived in Sydney, and there were 6 bobs all lined up, all about 200 kilos, and they all had 83 different drones. And I thought, well, this wasn't quite the journey I wanted to go on. So I sort of sat down. This is about intimacy and about contact, but it's important. It's an important document that we have to make. So we went off, we sort of arrived, this is with the Yakel on the island of Tanna, and the very first thing, Bob number 1 shouted, Jimmy, look, they're naked! And I said, oh, Jesus, wrong decision, I shouldn't be here. They sort of calmed down, we started making some kind of contact, and then so towards the end, the chief was, same process again, thank you for coming back, thank you for sharing the pictures in the book, and he said, come and join us in a picture, you've become one of us. So in a sort of very flattering way, sort of sitting there in this tree, making a picture of me. And then all of a sudden the tree went very quiet. And the tree started to murmur, and the chief sort of leaned into me through the voice of the interpreter and says, Jimmy, there's a massive problem. You realize this? And I thought, oh, Jesus, I've done it this time. Again, always overstepping the mark. And he sort of looked at me and says, there's a real problem with what you've done here. Oh, no, oh, Jesus, stupid me, stupid. He said, you've given me this book. And I said, yeah, I really tried. I've carried 4 of them halfway across the world with my cameras. You have no idea how to get that on his handbags. And he said, looking at me a bit confused, he said, but there's a massive problem. How are you going to solve it? And I said, I don't know, well, what's the problem? He said, you've given me my book, but there are 80 people in this village. Everybody wants a book as well. So I sort of looked back at myself in the tree and thought, oh no. So if there's anybody here who wants to go on a journey to Vanuatu and has a boat and a container, please contact me. I have to go back. And I'm going to leave you with one last story. Now, this is another little tribe. This is my tribe. Very significant in the context of this whole story about making contact and seeing one another. Perhaps the one tribe I sort of lost contact with the last few years is my own family, me and my sort of stupid photography. Here they are. When they were younger, they listened to me. They were very, very attentive, and they followed me around, and I painted them. I put them in cactuses and elephants and dangerous swings, and they did everything I ever dreamed of to photograph them. And then times changed. Puberty arrived. And my son here, who's 16, this was a couple of months ago, decided no contact anymore. But not only did he decide not to have any contact with me or my wife decided to remain on holiday. And this is a true story. We were away on vacation. She says, sweetie, do you mind if I'm going to stay on holiday for the next couple of weeks? I said, what do you mean stay on holiday? He said, I'm busy. I've got this project. And she says, yeah, but you've been telling everybody, you've been going around the world and finding yourself, making contact. I found myself in yoga, and I found this yoga instructor in a course, and I'd like to participate in it. You don't mind if I stay, do you? So I sort of looked a bit reluctant, and she said, it'd be very good for you to remake contact with the kids. So I said, fine. Sort of went back home on my own. Day 3, my son disappeared into the city. I live in Amsterdam. Had a mobile phone on him, it was turned off, and I started panicking, and I was sweating, and my youngest daughter came up to me and said, Dad, is it okay? And I said, no, I don't know where Narush is. And she goes, yeah, but you don't understand him. And I said, I know I don't, but he can't just ignore me. Yeah, he's become a goth. Goth? What's a goth? He's all into black these days, and you just don't understand that. I said, yeah, but I'd love to understand. She says, well, I can contact him, and why don't we this evening go to IKEA? We can buy some new things for his room, and we can, can make it sort of the beginning of a new contact. So that evening, he turned up, hat on, headphones in, grumpy, sort of jumped into the back of the car. We arrived in IKEA, and within half an hour, he'd disappeared. came back to me, very aggressive. He says, everything here is too colorful. I want black. Turned up his volume and disappeared. So I sort of sat down on the floor, and much the same as I did in sort of Kazakhstan on the top of the mountains, almost started crying, although it was Thursday evening in IKEA, so it wasn't probably the best place to make a sort of have a public breakdown. And Alaya, my daughter, came and said, Dad, should we ring Mum? And I said, no, don't ring Mum. I'm okay. We'll sort this out. And then all of a sudden she said, well, it's okay. She said, do you remember when we were children? We all lay in the bath together, and we used to stick these things on your head with balls on the end, and we used to hit them from side to side. Look what I found. I found these brushes, and she subsequently stuck one on my head, sitting on the floor, not thinking anything of it. Before I knew it, 10 other kids had come up and stuck them on my head too. So there I was, to all intents and purposes, looking like some sort of a contemporary tribal leader on a Thursday evening, sitting on the floor of IKEA on the verge of tears. And guess who came out of the shadows? My son. And this is true. He sort of came out of the shadows, took off his hat, took out his headphone, looked at me like this, got out his iPhone and made a picture and sort of walked off into the shadows. Didn't think anything of it. 2 days later, I'm at home, literally about to dial my wife. I really have lost him. And all of a sudden, the door bangs. And it's amazing. He sort of ran upstairs, and I'm sitting in my small study. And he ran, and he goes, Dad, look what's happened, look what's happened. He sort of started showing me his mobile phone and started panicking. Is it something to do with Mum? No, it's not Mum. It's look what I've done, look what I've done. And I'm sort of trying to focus with my aging eyes. And he goes, I've got 1.5 million likes, 1.5 million likes. I go, 1.5, well, what have you done? He said, well, I took a picture of you the other night in IKEA, and I posted it on 9gag, and I wrote underneath, the perks of being bald and bored in IKEA. And the whole world has contacted me. It's amazing. And he says, I have a favor to ask you. And I said, yeah, what, anything? He said, my whole class wants to meet you, because I've told them we're going to teach them how to make contact and get friends online by posting things. We can do that, can't we? So the next night, we had 35 kids sitting around the living room table, my son sitting next to me, the first contact in actual months, all pretending to teach them how to see each other online. That story besides, I'm going to leave you with this picture. Now, this picture is a sort of a symbolic picture. It's not necessarily my favorite picture, but it's a picture I'd like to leave you. If you look very closely in the eyes of this Nenet and the Yamal Peninsula, there's a picture of me. And a colleague of mine said, Jimmy, you have to share that picture of the Nenet, because that's perhaps what this whole story is about. This foundation you're going to set up, which is celebrating the polychromatic cultures of the world by your connection and awakening. It's what it's about. You have etched yourself into his soul by that reflection. And perhaps by sharing these pictures and these few humble stories with you, I hope I've etched something in your soul too. Thank you very much for listening.